General George S. Patton, Jr. was the most aggressive and arguably the most successful field commander the Allies possessed. He led troops and armies across the Mediterranean and European theaters, delivering decisive victories. His career was a tapestry of glorious, life-threatening moments. Yet his final chapter arrived unexpectedly, 12 days after a seemingly routine collision on a German road. Patton was a modern figure torn out of history books, who appeared to have been a man out of place and time. A figure who towered above even his highly respected peers. This stark contrast between his heroic life and quiet death remains the single most powerful factor fueling the decades of persistent skepticism about the true circumstances of his demise. Patton was born in 1885 and was a figure of intense contradiction, possessing both brilliant strategic acumen and a famously hot-tempered nature. His men, recognizing his demanding but ultimately effective leadership, colorfully referred to him as Old Blood and Guts, a nickname straight out of the 19th century. Patton demanded strict discipline and self-sacrifice, and in return, he delivered exceptional results, fostering immense pride within his ranks. In his early years, he was far from a model student, struggling with reading and spelling early on, leading some to speculate he lived with undiagnosed dyslexia. Yet, he matured into a voracious reader who later published numerous articles on military tactics for the War Department. Patton's personal life mirrored his military intensity. He was notoriously accident-prone, pursuing activities like polo with a reckless abandon. These accidents resulted in multiple serious injuries, including broken legs, a fractured nose, and frequent head injuries. Some historians have even claimed that these head injuries may have contributed to the erratic behavior that plagued his later career. His military philosophy hinged on relentless execution, speed, and adaptability. Arguably the Allies' most gifted tank commander, the pinnacle of his career was the dramatic, swift sweep of his Third Army across northern France in the summer of 1944. This campaign demonstrated initiative, ruthless drive, and a deliberate disregard for conservative military doctrine, capturing key cities like Le Mans and Reims. Patton's dedication to speed proved vital during the catastrophic German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He repositioned the Third Army with astonishing speed to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Belgium. By the time the Third Army ceased operations upon VE Day in May 1945, his forces had captured over 80,000 square miles of territory. Crucially, while incurring roughly 137,000 casualties, the Third Army inflicted 1.8 million casualties on the enemy, mostly in the form of men who surrendered. This incredible success established Patton as an irreplaceable military genius, at least while World War II was ongoing. His personality ensured he would remain a controversial figure destined for friction with the political establishment in peacetime. Following the collapse of the German regime, Patton's aggressive nature, which had been so essential to battlefield success, suddenly became a dangerous political liability. Patton found himself wholly unsuited for the administrative post-war role of commanding the U.S. 15th Army. The story of how he came to find himself in this role is defined by his political actions rather than any other issue. His outspokenness, always a feature of his command style, quickly transitioned from inspiring to inflammatory when confronted with the complex realities of nascent Cold War tensions. In September 1945, Patton ignited a firestorm by publicly questioning the necessity of the Allied policy of removing Germans who had been officials in the Reich from power. He publicly questioned why the American authorities had such a strong desire to wipe out the ideology that drove the Reich. This failure in diplomacy was too brazen for the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, who promptly removed Patton as the U.S. commander in Bavaria. From there, he was sidelined with the 15th Army, a role he would keep until his untimely death. More dangerously, Patton held a deep distrust of the Soviet Union in particular, and of communist ideology more generally. Much of the American leadership, including the late President Roosevelt, maintained a somewhat naive view of Stalin, hoping for post-war cooperation. Patton held no such illusions and viewed the Soviets as the next great global enemy. In private, he advocated for immediate, preemptive military action to push the Red Army back beyond the borders they had seized in Eastern Europe. Patton astutely observed that the Soviet supply lines were highly vulnerable, running on little more than ox carts. He also noted that the Soviets lost tens of millions of people on the Eastern Front and were exhausted from war. He noted that America didn't suffer these sort of consequences and could use both Europe and Europeans in the attack. Under this theory, this meant the Allies could have likely broken the Red Army's back permanently within months if they attacked immediately following VE Day. This demand for war with an ostensible ally represented a fundamental threat to the delicate geopolitical order being constructed by world leaders. Patton's fiery rhetoric meant he was a loose cannon capable of derailing fragile diplomatic efforts and starting a global war. In the eyes of both American officials seeking stability and Soviet officials determined to retain their gains, Patton had become an existential threat who needed silencing. This context of profound political antagonism is essential to understanding why the circumstances of his death continue to generate so much suspicion. The official account states that Patton suffered his fatal injuries on the morning of December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany. Patton, accompanied by his chief of staff, was heading out for a pleasant pheasant hunt. The general was riding in the back seat of his 1938 Cadillac staff car. At the wheel was his new chauffeur, Private Horace Woodring, who had a reputation as a speed demon. This was a trait that, ironically considering the outcome, appealed to the general. As the car sped over a railroad crossing, Woodring collided with a left-turning U.S. Army truck attempting to enter a nearby depot. While Patton's longtime previous driver had safely navigated thousands of miles under every condition imaginable, Woodring failed to avoid this simple, low-speed accident. Remarkably, Patton was the only person in either vehicle to suffer severe injury. He was rushed to the 135th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where X-rays revealed his neck was broken. Specifically, there was a fractured C3 vertebra and a dislocation at C4 and C5, resulting in complete quadriplegia. For 12 days, Patton lay in traction. The medical reality of his injury in 1945 cannot be overstated. Traumatic spinal cord injuries, even today, present a high risk of fatal complications. For a patient immobilized with quadriplegia in the mid-1940s, the end was imminent. The official report confirms that Patton died quietly in his sleep on the evening of December 21, 1945, due to a pulmonary embolism. A blood clot, forming in his paralyzed lower body, had traveled to his heart or lungs, stopping the circulation. Patton's death quickly generated an atmosphere of deep distrust, transforming the official accident narrative into one of the most hotly contested events of the immediate post-war period. Those closest to Patton, including his brother-in-law Fred Ayer Jr., an officer with counterintelligence in Germany, immediately suspected foul play. This skepticism wasn't merely emotional, it stemmed from the convergence of Patton's extreme political isolation and certain irregularities surrounding the official investigation. The lack of comprehensive, publicly accessible documentation became a key pillar of the conspiracy theories. It's claimed that Patton himself, in an act of compassion, ordered the investigation halted, indicating he believed that this was an accident. This decision, coupled with the alleged destruction or disappearance of military files, created a substantial informational vacuum that has since been interpreted as a cover-up. The primary theories focus on two distinct sets of actors who possessed powerful motives. First, the Soviet NKVD is often cited, driven by Patton's open declaration of intent to initiate a war against the Red Army. Second, theories point toward internal American elements, specifically alleging the involvement of the Office of Strategic Services. This was the intelligence agency that would splinter into the CIA and other intelligence agencies after the war. Some have speculated that Patton was neutralized as a dangerous political factor, though no proof of this exists. The methods proposed for his assassination vary, often aligning perfectly with the official facts to avoid contradiction. Some more outlandish theories suggest that Patton was actually shot during the low-speed collision, explaining why no one else was injured. Unsurprisingly, though, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest this was the case, and this would suggest a much wider conspiracy. The most common theories suggest that his death by pulmonary embolism was simply not prevented, and that in essence he died of neglect. This would, in essence, involve the members of his medical team being compromised, either by the Soviets or by sinister elements within the American government. In the end, General Patton was an American titan, a man whose military achievements cemented his place as one of the greatest operational commanders the world has ever seen. His Third Army's legacy of fortitude, audacity, and valor will likely endure throughout the rest of human history. Yet the circumstances of his passing are inextricably linked to his personality. The very aggressiveness that drove him to victory made him both a military genius and, ultimately, a political liability when the fighting stopped. Officially, Patton's death was a tragic statistical accident, the result of a catastrophic spinal injury suffered by an already accident-prone man. However, the strikingly mundane circumstances of his death combined with his outspoken nature means that theories surrounding his death will continue to be discussed alongside his legacy. In the end, the death of General Patton almost feels too small for the size of the man. History is full of towering figures whose final moments never seem to match the legends built around them. Ancient writers understood this discomfort well. They couldn't accept that heroes who shaped empires and toppled kingdoms might simply fall to fever, accident, or age. So they crafted grand exits. Kings were struck down by omens, warriors were claimed by gods, and great leaders met finales worthy of the myths that surrounded them. A mundane death felt like an insult to a monumental life, and we haven't outgrown that impulse. We instinctively resist simple explanations when a giant of history dies quietly. Patton's car crash, paralysis, and hospital decline don't feel like the proper curtain call for one of the greatest field commanders in history. That mismatch invites speculation, and once speculation enters the room, conspiracy theories aren't far behind. That said, while I can't prove it in any way based on the actual evidence we have, Patton's untimely death has always seemed very off to me. Imagine the most admired soldier on the German side of the Second World War, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, celebrated even by his enemies as the chivalrous Desert Fox. But in a quiet room in October 1944, this general would be felled not by the Allies, but by his own government. This was the dramatic culmination of Rommel's ambiguous, yet ultimately fatal, connection to the deadliest internal opposition Hitler ever faced. This was the July 20th plot, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, a plot to eliminate the Führer. After this, the regime needed its greatest hero to vanish quietly, transforming him overnight from a revered military leader into a state-sanctioned martyr. According to the Reich, the war's most popular commander had turned against the leadership and targeted the Austrian artist himself. But to this day, Historians question to what extent, if any, the desert fox was truly involved in the plot that would ultimately end his life. Erwin Rommel was born in 1891 and embarked on a distinguished military career beginning in World War I, where he earned recognition for his bravery and tactical brilliance. His reputation soared during the early years of the Second World War as the commander of the Afrika Korps in North Africa. Rommel's tactical genius was often juxtaposed with a perceived chivalrous conduct toward his enemies, which helped cultivate a specific historical narrative. By March 1943, having faced overwhelming logistical challenges and superior numbers in North Africa, he was recalled back to Germany. After some shuffling, he would ultimately be assigned to Army Group B, tasked with defending the Normandy coast against the impending Allied invasion. Rommel recognized that the Austrian corporal's strategic incompetence would lead Germany to complete ruin. It was this pragmatic realization of inevitable defeat, compounded by a growing moral unease, that drove him to seek an avenue for a separate peace with the Western Allies. Operation Valkyrie was the code name given to the German military contingency plan designed to be implemented by the Reserve Army in case of massive civil unrest within Germany. The military conspirators, desperate to end the war after strategic disasters like the defeat at Stalingrad, repurposed this bureaucratic plan to serve as the blueprint for their coup d'etat. The leaders of the plot included respected officers, and the central figure who carried out the assassination attempt was Lieutenant Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. The plan had two critical phases. The first was the assassination of the head of state, which Stauffenberg attempted on July 20th, 1944. This was to occur by placing a bomb hidden in a briefcase during a conference at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The second phase, contingent on the success of the first part, involved the immediate activation of the Valkyrie orders across Germany. The Reserve Army was to seize key government installations in Berlin, disarm loyal SS units, and arrest high-ranking officials. Critically, the plan required the senior commanders in the West, where Rommel commanded Army Group B, to consolidate power and neutralize the Reich's apparatus there. The political objectives were straightforward: form a new government and then negotiate an armistice with the Allies on somewhat favorable terms. The conspirators desperately needed a figure of immense international stature to lend legitimacy to the new regime and signal seriousness to the Western powers during peace negotiations. This necessity made the involvement of a highly respected field marshal like Rommel indispensable. Rommel was undeniably connected to the resistance through his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, who was himself involved in the plot. Evidence indicates that while Rommel agreed completely with the need to remove Germany's leader from power, he drew a fundamental line at assassination. Rommel allegedly viewed the deliberate slaying of the head of state, regardless of how tyrannical that leader was, with distaste, preferring a less violent approach. According to reports from his son and statements from others connected to the plot, Rommel supported a coup that would arrest the leader and place him on trial for his crimes. This wasn't just a moral distaste, though. There was a practical element to it, and he believed that this would simply turn the man into a martyr. Conversely, a public trial would expose his military incompetence and crimes, and would serve to delegitimize the entire ideology. But that brings us to the question of how much Rommel actually knew about the plot. Despite his aversion to the bomb, Rommel's commitment to the broader effort to overthrow the regime was established through testimony under duress. And it must be stated here that the methodology with which these confessions were extracted leaves a lot of questions. Even if no direct threats were made, it was well established by 1944 that if you fell out of line, recriminations would occur, and even your family may be fair game. One conspirator who acted as a liaison to Rommel confessed that Rommel had agreed to actively support the coup. Another resistance leader indicated that the plotters saw Rommel as potentially the future leader of Germany after a transition phase. They saw him as someone who the Western Allies respected and as someone who wasn't completely tainted by the previous regime. The timing of the July 20th plot proved disastrous for Rommel. 3 days before Stauffenberg planted the bomb, on July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighter planes in Normandy, leaving him severely wounded. This injury removed him from the crucial chain of command in the West, just as the coup was launched. The injury, however, provided a convenient cover story later used by the regime. When the bomb failed to land, the resulting purge was swift and brutal. Thousands were arrested and hundreds were executed. Rommel was first implicated when General Stolpnagel, badly injured and captured, repeatedly muttered Rommel's name. He was then subject to brutal quote-unquote interrogation, where he named Rommel as an active supporter of the scheme. The compromised nature of all these confessions, extracted under duress, became the flimsy yet decisive basis for implicating the field marshal. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home with the evidence of his participation. They presented him with an ultimatum: face a public trial before the notorious People's Court and risk harm to his family and friends, or swallow a cyanide capsule. Rommel, in this moment, chose the capsule in exchange for the promise that his wife and son would be left in peace. The regime immediately set about controlling the narrative of Rommel's death. The official paper reported that the beloved field marshal had succumbed to the severe head injuries sustained during the air attack in Normandy. By covering up the event and presenting it as a hero's death, the regime successfully contained the political fallout. There was a full state funeral for Rommel, transforming the secret assassination of the field marshal into a national spectacle for a fallen hero. Exposing Rommel as a traitor would have confirmed to the German populace that opposition was widespread, reaching the highest, most trusted ranks of the Wehrmacht. This would have been a devastating propaganda defeat that the regime couldn't afford in the closing stages of the war. The complexity surrounding Rommel's role ensured the longevity of the historical debate, heavily influenced by the post-war political environment. For decades, the dominant Rommel myth persisted, portraying him as a brilliant, apolitical figure who was merely a tragic victim of the regime. Modern historiography, however, presents a more nuanced picture. While early accounts often presented Rommel's support for the conspiracy as established fact, subsequent research has demonstrated the high degree of ambiguity. At present, the mainstream view acknowledges that Rommel was sympathetic to the goals of the resistance and wanted the painter gone, but didn't agree that assassination was the answer. Many historians now believe that he was organizing his own coup attempt, separate from the July 20th plot, since he fundamentally disagreed with their approach. They've also now accepted that Rommel will almost certainly always remain an ambiguous figure, whose true motivation and involvement will never be known. What's clear is that he was a superb field commander who, late in the war, found his professional loyalty to Germany supersede his political oath to the man at the helm of the state. Hey everyone, before we go on, just hitting you with a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you haven't done so already. Now with that said, let's get back down to business. It was the ultimate air defense response to the ultimate non-threat. In the pre-dawn hours of February 25th, 1942, the City of Angels plunged into a mandatory blackout, only to have the sky violently illuminated by the flashes of anti-aircraft rounds. For nearly an hour, a monumental volume of high-explosive ordnance poured into the night sky, aimed at supposed enemy aircraft. The explosive truth, however, was that these forces had mounted a massive, aggressive, and entirely self-inflicted engagement against an adversary that simply wasn't there. The Great Los Angeles Air Raid, as contemporary sources termed it, can't be understood without appreciating the atmosphere of dread gripping the West Coast in the winter of 1942. Less than 3 months prior, the attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the sense of continental invulnerability. This was replaced with the chilling reality that Imperial Japan could theoretically strike anywhere along the Pacific Rim. As a consequence, many West Coast cities instituted strict nightly blackouts and curfews. This period was also marked by deep suspicion of infiltration, culminating just days earlier with President Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066. This is the now infamous order which authorized the eventual mass incarceration of Japanese Americans on the basis of their ancestry alone. The psychological tension was yanked to a breaking point immediately preceding the Los Angeles incident. On February 23, 1942, the war literally arrived on California's doorstep when the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced near Santa Barbara and shelled oil facilities at Elwood. This attack marked the first time the continental United States had been directly attacked by a foreign power in over a century. Although the damage to the oil pier and equipment amounted to only about $500, the psychological impact was devastating. Rumors of an imminent, massive West Coast invasion spread rapidly, transforming generalized anxiety into acute, immediate expectation of attack. This environment meant that when radar picked up the next ambiguous target, the entire population was primed for mass panic and immediate, overwhelming reaction. The chain of events that led to the barrage began on the evening of February 24th with an initial temporary alert. Radar detected an unidentified target approximately 120 miles west of Los Angeles, prompting sirens to sound at 7:18 p.m. Thousands of air raid sirens went off across Los Angeles County, striking terror into the hearts of everyday citizens. This initial alarm was eventually lifted late that night, somewhat easing the tension. However, the calm was fleeting. After midnight, the situation quickly deteriorated. Radar systems once again tracked an unidentified object approaching the coast. This eventually caused anti-aircraft batteries to be placed on high alert at 2:15 that morning. Just 5 minutes later, an alert went out that mandated a full and complete citywide blackout. Reports began to flood official channels indicating that civilians were seeing enemy planes flying overhead. These reports solidified when a Coast Artillery colonel reported sighting what he estimated to be about 25 planes flying at 12,000 feet over the city. Suddenly, the situation went from a remote threat to deadly serious. This sensory chaos, amplified by the mandatory darkness, became the basis for action. At 2:25 a.m. on February 25th, air raid sirens blared again, mobilizing gunners into position. Between 3:15 and 4:15, the military response commenced. Searchlights, sometimes 9 powerful beams at once, swept the skies, converging on the suspected targets. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire, unleashing a torrential barrage of tracer rounds and high-explosive shells, causing the air over Los Angeles to erupt. Despite the severity of the ground response, the Army Air Forces demonstrated a degree of prudence, ordering pursuit planes to remain grounded. This decision reflected a rational command calculation to preserve limited fighter forces until the scale and direction of the supposed attack could be confirmed. Further, the Army air commanders questioned the Japanese ability to move an entire fleet with an aircraft carrier so deep into continental American waters. Regardless of their more rational response, the anti-aircraft units continued firing off and on for hours. The indiscriminate firing continued until the coastal artillery finally announced a ceasefire around dawn. The all clear was not sounded until 7:21 a.m. When the blackout order was finally lifted, citizens discovered that the true damage wasn't caused by Japanese bombs, but by American shrapnel. Over 1,000 heavy shells designed to explode at altitude failed to detonate and rain down across a 40-mile arc, stretching from Santa Monica to Long Beach. Shrapnel damaged buildings and vehicles, with reports describing fragments piercing homes and even landing in civilians' beds. Perhaps unsurprisingly, no enemy planes were ever found, and no wreckage was ever recovered to indicate a Japanese presence. The human toll was tragic and entirely indirect. 5 civilians died as a result of the incident. 3 of these fatalities occurred due to traffic accidents spurred by the chaos of the citywide blackout and panicked movement. Additionally, 2 others died from heart attacks, which contemporary accounts attributed to the overwhelming stress of the bombardment. A number of the anti-aircraft station operators were also injured, while frantically reporting to their posts that night. The lack of any tangible enemy threat following such an immense military effort immediately led to profound public confusion and institutional conflict. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, held a press conference shortly after the incident, publicly declaring the purported attack to be nothing more than a false alarm. He attributed the whole event to anxiety and jittery nerves in the wake of recent events. However, this attempt to quell the panic was instantly undermined by the Army. Secretary of War Henry Stimson contradicted Knox, insisting that between 1 and 15 unidentified aircraft had been sighted over the area. Stimson hypothesized that these targets might have been commercial aircraft flown by enemy agents operating out of secret airfields in Mexico. According to him, these operatives may have been Japanese, or they may have been German, or they may even have been local Mexican sympathizers or American Fifth columnists. This immediate and severe disagreement between the highest levels of the military and government fueled public suspicion. Local newspapers deepened the confusion. The Los Angeles Times, for instance, prominently declared that the area had been raided by foreign aircraft. This lack of authoritative unity meant that a physical error, firing at nothing, was quickly transformed into a political controversy. This in turn would provide the essential starting point for decades of speculation about a cover-up. Although the controversy raged in the immediate aftermath, military historians and analysts have since constructed a clear and rational explanation for the quote-unquote battle. In essence, to drop a meme, California hurt itself in its confusion, but it's a bit more complicated than that. The official theory centers on the idea of mass hysteria and misidentification, a phenomenon fueled by the preceding day's events. A significant review conducted in 1949 by the United States Coast Artillery Association identified a specific meteorological balloon, launched at 1 o'clock that morning. According to them, this was the single object likely responsible for triggering the entire incident. The review concluded that once the initial firing commenced, the spectacle of searchlights and exploding shells caused the collective imagination to create additional targets in the sky. They also speculated that some of the defenders simply went along with the crowd, even though they didn't see anything at all. In my mind, it's basically the 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong effect. If so many other people are doing it, you ought to be doing it too. The fact that multiple batteries opened fire, seeing the light show caused by their neighbors, led to an exponential increase in reported so-called enemy contacts. This theory gained greater official weight in 1983 when the U.S. Office of Air Force History revisited the event. They concluded that the Battle of Los Angeles was a textbook case of war nerves triggered by a lost weather balloon. Further supporting this consensus is the technical critique that the targets, whatever they were moving too slowly to be the high-speed Japanese warplanes. Moreover, post-war intelligence provided the final confirmation. Japanese authorities affirmed that they had not sent any aircraft over Los Angeles during the time of the air raid. While it might be natural to doubt this, given the extreme horrors that the post-war Japanese government admitted to the Americans, this event doesn't even rank. In the history of World War II, the Battle of Los Angeles is often cited as a prime example of massive defensive overreaction and institutional confusion. Yet, the lack of definitive, unified governmental closure in 1942 allowed the incident to transcend its factual basis and grow into one of our great modern mysteries. The void left by the contradictory statements of Secretaries Knox and Stimson became fertile ground for speculation. Decades later, specifically with the rise of interest in extraterrestrial visitation, the narrative shifted dramatically. Proponents seized upon the event, asserting that the massive anti-aircraft barrage proved that the military had engaged with spacecraft. This powerful narrative often relies heavily on a single piece of visual evidence, a photograph published by the Los Angeles Times on February 26, 1942. The image appears to show searchlights converging on a central massive object in the sky. However, it's been noted that this photo was heavily retouched by the newspaper's photo editors to improve contrast and visibility for black and white newsprint. Critics argue that this routine artistic enhancement created the illusion of a distinct solid object encircled by the lights. It is one of history's most haunting ironies that the man who planned the most audacious attack on American soil was also the man who predicted it would doom the Japanese. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto wasn't merely a naval strategist, he was a witness to American might in the industrial age. Decades before the first Zero fighter lifted off a carrier deck, Yamamoto had served as a naval attaché in Washington. During his time in this role, he had ridden trains across the vast American continent, watched the oil gush from the derricks in Texas, and stood on the factory floors of Detroit. There, amidst the roar of assembly lines and the smoke of blast furnaces, he saw the terrible arithmetic of modern war. He understood then what the hardliners in Tokyo refused to accept, that courage cannot defeat physics, and that spirit cannot stop a production line that runs 24 hours a day. When the Prime Minister asked him in 1940 about the prospects of a war with the Anglo-American powers, Yamamoto didn't offer the comforting platitudes of a loyal soldier. Instead, he offered a chillingly precise schedule of doom. He told the Prime Minister that if ordered to fight, he would have great success for the first 6 months, perhaps even a year, securing a string of stunning victories. But he warned that if the war dragged on beyond that opening gambit, he had absolutely no expectation of success. He knew that once the American giant woke up and converted those auto plants into tank factories and those oil fields into aviation fuel, Japan would be crushed. He said that the Americans possessed superior logistics beyond what the Japanese could even dream of. Long before the attack on Pearl Harbor was even a tactical blueprint, the Japanese government possessed a secret weapon that should have stopped the war before it began. This was the Total War Research Institute, and despite its name, it was established to act as a rational check on the fiery ambitions of the military. In the fall of 1941, just months before the outbreak of hostilities, the Institute produced a simulation of a potential conflict with the United States and Great Britain. The findings were beyond just pessimistic, and they predicted absolute utter catastrophe. The analysts ran the numbers on shipping tonnage, oil reserves, steel production, and bauxite imports. They simulated the flow of resources from the southern resource area, the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, that the Army planned to seize. The report concluded that while Japan might seize these territories, it lacked the merchant marine capacity to transport the resources back to the home islands. The simulation predicted that American submarines and aircraft would ravage Japanese shipping lanes, severing the jugular of the empire. The Institute warned that Japan's material strength would peak almost immediately and then begin a precipitous decline, while American industrial output would grow exponentially. They estimated that the tipping point would occur roughly 2 years into the conflict, after which the disparity would become unmanageable. This was a calculation based on the known output of American steel mills and the known consumption rates of the Imperial Navy. However, when this report was presented to the liaison conferences, the high-level meetings between the government and the military high command, it was met with hostility. General Hideki Tojo, then the war minister, and his faction viewed the data not as a warning to be heeded, but as an obstacle to be overcome by spiritual fortitude. They argued that the analysts were ignoring the intangible factors of war, the unique Japanese spirit, the unity of the people, and the willingness to sacrifice. This isn't an exaggeration. Tojo legitimately thought that the quote-unquote Yamato spirit would crush America. This was despite the fact that Tojo didn't dispute that. On paper, this was a David and Goliath situation. The report was suppressed, its authors marginalized, and the government chose to proceed with a bizarre and audacious strategy. They would strike hard, seize all the resources they could, and then hope that the United States, demoralized by the blow, would negotiate a peace. It was a strategy built on the psychological assessment of an enemy they didn't truly understand, while simultaneously ignoring all the data. At the same time, the army was drunk on the successes of its campaigns in China and the allure of political dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy was simultaneously suffering. The Navy was the service that had to fight the Americans across the vastness of the Pacific, and its leaders were technocrats who understood the risks. Admiral Osami Nagano, the chief of the Naval General Staff, and his subordinates were acutely aware of the oil problem. Japan imported over 80% of its oil, the vast majority of it from the United States. The American embargo imposed in 1941 had started a countdown clock. Every day the fleet sat at anchor. It burned fuel it couldn't replace. The Navy agreed to the war, not because they believed they could win a protracted conflict, but because they believed they would slowly asphyxiate if they did nothing. Yamamoto's strategy for Pearl Harbor was born of this desperation. He didn't design the attack to conquer America. He designed it to buy time. He hoped that by shattering the Pacific Fleet, he could create a small window of opportunity in which Japan could force terms on a demoralized American populace. But privately, Yamamoto remained despondent. Letters he wrote to friends during this period reveal a man who felt he was being ordered to destroy Japan. He knew that if the Americans refused to negotiate, if they got angry instead of scared, the war was lost before the first ship left harbor. And unlike the vast majority of Japanese, Yamamoto had lived in America. He knew that the Americans possessed a rugged national character, and like the Japanese also took honor seriously. While he didn't outright say it, he in essence knew that the insane plan he hatched was doomed to fail, because he knew Americans too well. For the first 6 months of 1942, it appeared that the hardliners were right and the math was wrong. The Japanese military machine swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, they all fell like dominoes. The British Empire's fortress at Singapore, thought to be impregnable, surrendered to a numerically inferior Japanese force. To the Japanese, this was clear confirmation of the superior nature of the national character of their people versus the weak and decadent Westerners. The illusion of invincibility took hold of the nation, and rational thought went out the window. The public was euphoric, fed a steady diet of propaganda that portrayed the Americans and British as soft, decadent, and incapable of fighting a warrior nation. This phenomenon, later diagnosed by historians and Japanese officials alike as the victory disease, blinded the leadership to the underlying fragility of their position. They extended their defensive perimeter far beyond what their logistics could support, convinced that the enemy was on the ropes. But the technocrats in the logistics bureaus knew better. Even during these victories, the merchant marine was losing ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The resource flow from the south was already trickling rather than flooding, hampered by inefficiency and the nascent American submarine threat. The clock struck midnight on the Japanese dream in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. In the span of a single day, the Imperial Navy lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Also critically, they lost the cream of their Naval Aviation Corps. These were pilots who had trained for hundreds of hours, veterans of the China War and the Pearl Harbor attack. The reaction of the Imperial General Headquarters to this catastrophe set a pattern of deception that would doom the Japanese war effort. Instead of confronting the disaster and adjusting their strategy, they buried it. The defeat was classified as a top-secret state affair. The surviving sailors and airmen who returned to Japan weren't greeted as heroes or comforted as wounded veterans. They were treated like carriers of a plague. They were isolated in hospital wards, forbidden from contacting their families, and strictly monitored to ensure they did not spread the truth of the defeat. The government released a communiqué claiming a great victory, admitting only to the loss of 1 carrier, while claiming to have decimated the American fleet. Even Prime Minister Tojo was kept in the dark about the full extent of the losses for weeks. The emperor was informed in a private audience, but he too participated in the cover-up, instructing the naval leaders that this news must not be allowed out. Communication between the Navy and the Army was almost non-existent, and the Army was kept in the dark about the true nature of the losses. This conspiracy of silence meant that the Army continued to plan its operations based on the assumption of naval support that no longer existed. The Navy knew the offensive war was over. They had lost the initiative, and given the disparity in shipbuilding capacity, they knew they would never get it back. The Americans could build replacement carriers in parallel in a matter of months. For Japan, a single carrier would take years. If Midway was the tactical turning point, the campaign for Guadalcanal was the strategic confirmation that the Total War Research Institute had been right all along. For 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, Japan and the United States poured resources into a remote island in the Solomons. It became a pure test of logistical capacity, a war of attrition where the side that could land more food, bullets, and aviation fuel would win. Japan failed this test miserably. The Navy lost huge numbers of destroyers and aircraft trying to resupply the starving garrison. The soldiers on the island were reduced to eating roots, lizards, and eventually, reportedly, their own dead. The Japanese logistical chain simply snapped. They couldn't protect their transports from American air power, and they couldn't build airfields fast enough to contest the airspace. By late 1942, the reality of the situation began to penetrate the fog of the General Staff. The Army and Navy, bitter rivals who generally didn't speak, were forced into a grim consensus. They had to withdraw. The evacuation of Guadalcanal in early 1943 was a masterpiece of tactical execution, but it was a strategic admission of defeat. The government euphemistically called it a transfer of forces to a new defensive line, but inside the Ministry of War, the mood was funereal. A former officer later remarked that for the Japanese military, the war effectively ended at Guadalcanal. In September 1943, the Imperial General Headquarters drew a line in the ocean. They established the Absolute National Defense Zone, a perimeter stretching from the Kuriles in the north through the Marianas and Carolines to western New Guinea and the Philippines. The strategic directive was clear. This line must be held at all costs. If the Americans breached this line, the home islands would be vulnerable to direct attack. But privately, the assessments were growing darker. Rear Admiral Soichi Takagi, a brilliant analyst attached to the Naval General Staff, began a study in late 1943 to analyze the war's lessons. He looked at the loss rates of merchant shipping, which were skyrocketing as American submarines began to hunt in wolf packs. He looked at the aircraft production figures, which showed that while Japan was producing more planes than before, the quality was dropping. Further yet, the pilots flying them were barely trained at all, with many only having a dozen hours in the air before deployment. The Americans, meanwhile, were introducing new Hellcat and Corsair fighters that outclassed the Zero, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of training. Takagi concluded that Japan could not win. He presented his verbal report to Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai and other senior figures in March 1944. His recommendation was radical. Japan should seek a compromise peace immediately, even if it meant giving up its conquests, including Manchuria. This was dangerous talk. The military police, the Kempeitai, were arresting people for defeatism, for saying far less. Takagi's report circulated quietly among senior statesmen who were beginning to believe that Tojo was a madman. The summer of 1944 brought the war to the doorstep of the Japanese ruling class. The American invasion of the Marianas, specifically the island of Saipan, was the blow that shattered the Tojo dictatorship. Saipan was the key to the absolute national defense zone. The army had promised the emperor that it was impregnable, a fortress that would break the American advance. Instead, the Japanese garrison was annihilated. The Imperial Navy made a desperate sortie to save the island, resulting in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. To give you a sense of how badly this went for Japan, this became known to the American servicemen involved as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Hundreds of planes were shot down for the loss of a handful of American aircraft. The disparity in technology and training had become a completely unbridgeable chasm. The loss of Saipan meant that the American B-29 Superfortress bombers were now within range of Tokyo. The theoretical threat of industrial destruction became an immediate, terrifying reality. This forced senior Japanese statesmen to finally make their move, led by former prime ministers like Keisuke Okada and Fumimaro Kono, maneuvered to force Tojo out of the top job. They understood that Tojo, as the face of the war, could never negotiate a peace. He was too committed, too symbolic. This was the man who staked his entire career upon the indomitable Yamato spirit smashing the decadent Anglo-American order. Tojo resisted, trying to reshuffle his cabinet and cling to power, but the loss of confidence was total. He resigned on July 18, 1944. The fall of his cabinet was the first public crack in the regime's facade. Officers in the once elite but now increasingly weakened Kwantung Army and bureaucrats in Tokyo quietly whispered that the war was over. They knew that if Saipan couldn't be held, nothing could be held. Yet the system was paralyzed. The new prime minister, General Kuniaki Koiso, was a compromise candidate, a man without the power to challenge the army hardliners. He was given a mandate not to surrender, but to continue the war in the desperate hope of achieving one decisive victory that would allow Japan to negotiate with honor. This was a delusion that would cost millions of lives across Asia. By February 1945, The American bombers were turning Japanese cities into ash with massive firebombing campaigns. The merchant marine was gone, the factories were starving for raw materials, and the people were beginning to starve for food. Prince Fumimaro Kono, the man who had been prime minister when the war in China began, secured a private audience with Emperor Hirohito. In what became known as the Kono Memorial, the prince delivered a stark and terrifying message to the throne. He told the emperor that defeat was inevitable. That was a foregone conclusion. But he argued that the greater danger was no longer the American military, but the threat of a communist revolution at home. Kono believed that the destruction of the economy and the influence of radical elements within the military would lead to an uprising that would overthrow the imperial system itself. He urged the emperor to sue for peace immediately to save the imperial house before social order collapsed completely. The emperor, however, was not ready to give up. Influenced by the military leadership, he still clung to the hope of a Tennozan, a decisive battle. He told Kono that it would be too difficult to seek peace unless the military achieved one more gain. This rejection sealed the fate of Okinawa. The emperor and the high command decided to gamble everything on the defense of that island, hoping that the bloodletting would be so severe that the Americans would recoil. In April 1945, the Koiso cabinet fell, a casualty of the invasion of Okinawa. Senior officials met to select a new leader who could navigate the ship of state through the coming storm. They chose Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, a 77-year-old hero of the Russo-Japanese War. Suzuki's appointment was viewed with deep suspicion by the army. They feared he would become a Japanese Badoglio. Marshal Pietro Badoglio was the Italian general who had taken over after Mussolini was deposed and had promptly negotiated a surrender with the Allies. The term Badoglio became common in Japanese military circles, a synonym for a traitor who would sell out the nation to save his own skin. The military police kept the Suzuki cabinet under strict surveillance, watching for any sign of quote-unquote defeatism. Suzuki publicly exhorted the nation to fight to the bitter end, declaring that the war had entered a decisive stage where anything but optimism was forbidden. But privately, he knew the game was up. He later admitted that when he saw the B-29s flying over Japan with impunity, he realized that the country had no means to defend itself. His mission, understood by the peace faction, but never spoken aloud, was to find a way to end the war without triggering a military coup that would destroy the government. As the summer of 1945 approached, the Japanese government trapped itself in a final, fatal delusion. The leadership couldn't bring themselves to approach the United States directly since they refused the demand for unconditional surrender. They wrongly believed that this would mean the destruction of the emperor and the potential that he would face a military tribunal. Some even feared that Hirohito could be shipped off to China to face justice for his actions that led to the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese. Instead, these hardliners decided to pin their hopes on the Soviet Union. The Japanese leadership convinced themselves that Moscow would be willing to mediate a peace settlement. They reasoned that Stalin would want to prevent the United States from becoming too dominant in East Asia and might therefore help Japan preserve some of its status. The reality of this delusion was brutally exposed in a series of telegrams between Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo in Tokyo and Ambassador Sato in Moscow. These cables, intercepted and decrypted by American intelligence, provide the most tragic real-time commentary on the Japanese refusal to accept defeat. Togo, under pressure from the military to find a diplomatic miracle, instructed Sato to seek Soviet help. Sato, living in the grim reality of the Soviet capital, fired back with withering sarcasm and desperate realism. He told Togo that the Soviets had absolutely no interest in helping Japan. He pointed out that Japan's proposed concessions such as returning territories they had already lost on the battlefield, were laughable. Sato eventually confirmed that the Soviets were probably preparing to attack Japan, rather than helping the nation out. Despite this stern and prophetic warning, Sato's words were ignored, and the idea of the Soviet Union as a potential savior bizarrely continued to spread. On July 26, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The alternative, they warned, was prompt and utter destruction with weaponry of untold power. Prime Minister Suzuki, attempting to hold his fragile coalition together, held a press conference where he was asked what his response was. He used a word in Japanese which translates either to treating with silent contempt or simply to withhold comment while contemplating. Two very different meanings. The Allies interpreted this as a defiant rejection. This potential linguistic error provided the final justification to bring down the sun on the land where it rises. The end came with a cascade of shocks that shattered the remaining pillars of Japanese resistance. On August 6, the first atomic bomb obliterated Hiroshima. The Army's initial reaction was denial. They sent a team to investigate, but even before the report came back, the hardliners tried to argue that it was just a powerful conventional bomb. Then, on the night of August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. This was, in many ways, a greater psychological blow to the military leadership than the atomic bomb. The Army's entire defensive strategy for the home islands relied on the idea that the Kwantung Army in Manchuria was intact and that the Soviets would remain neutral. In a matter of hours, the Red Army sliced through the Japanese lines, revealing that the vaunted Kwantung Army was a hollow shell, stripped of its best units to defend the Pacific. The dream of Soviet mediation, which was the official belief of the hardliners, also died instantly. On August 9th, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Yet as incredible as it seems, some in the leadership still wanted one more decisive battle before negotiation. In the sweltering, airless bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, the leaders of Japan met to decide the fate of the nation. It was August 9th, and the news of Nagasaki had just arrived. The Soviets were pouring into Manchuria, and the 6 leading figures in the Japanese leadership were split 3 against 3 on what to do next. On the side of peace were Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yonai. They argued that Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration with the sole condition that the emperor's status be preserved. On the side of war were War Minister Korochika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Suemu Toyoda. The emperor himself was in attendance, potentially there to break any deadlock, though no one dared to suggest what the emperor should or should not do. Importantly, the emperor was considered a living god in a sense, and the other leaders believed he had the power to speak not as a man, but as a very literal deity. The arguments of the war faction were a chilling reflection of the samurai ethos carried to its logical extreme. They didn't argue that Japan could win. They admitted the situation was desperate, but they insisted that Japan could not surrender without one last battle. They proposed 4 conditions for surrender, with the foremost being the preservation of the emperor and the imperial family. They also demanded no occupation by Allied troops, disarmament to be carried out by the Japanese themselves, and war crimes trials to be conducted by the Japanese government. War Minister Anami went even further, though. He said he was willing to sacrifice up to 100 million people to preserve Japanese honor. That is to say, he wanted the nation as a whole to end itself, rather than admit defeat to foreigners. Anami was no armchair general either, and he would be willing to follow through with his views, regardless of what the emperor said. The debate raged for hours. The cabinet was paralyzed by the requirement for unanimity. Finally, in an act of unprecedented political theater, Prime Minister Suzuki rose and did the unthinkable. He turned to the emperor, who had been sitting silently, and asked him to break the deadlock. Emperor Hirohito was a man who had been briefed on the hopelessness of the war for years, and who had seen the reports from the Total War Research Institute before hostilities. According to the official narrative, the emperor then finally spoke up and gave his decision. Now here I say the official narrative because some historians have questioned whether this version of events was told simply to save the emperor and imperial house, but I digress. He said that the Japanese nation had brought cruelty to the world and had lost, and then he made the Go-Saidan. This was a sacred proclamation, speaking in his status as a god emperor, rather than in his own voice. Simply put, it was an order that was, in essence, heretical to defy. Even then, it was not over. The young officers of the War Ministry, refusing to accept surrender, launched a coup attempt known as the Kyujo Incident. They slew the commander of the Imperial Guard, forged orders, and searched the palace for the recording of the emperor's surrender speech, intending to destroy it. According to the conspirators, they believed that the emperor had been forced to surrender. They burned the home of Prime Minister Suzuki, but the coup failed because the senior leadership of the army, including Anami, refused to join it after the emperor had spoken. General Anami, torn between his loyalty to the emperor and his loyalty to the army, chose the only path his code allowed. On the morning of August 15th, as the emperor's voice was broadcast to the nation, Anami wrote a poem expressing his apologies and faded into history. So that brings me back to the question of when the Japanese knew the war was over, and that ultimately has no single date on the calendar. The Total War Research Institute knew that any war against America was over before it even began. The bureaucrats knew it in 1941. The Navy knew in 1942. The cabinet knew in 1944. The diplomats knew in early 1945. The army itself may not have ever fully accepted it, since they wanted to sacrifice every single person in Japan to preserve their honor. Japan's defeat was a failure of acceptance. The leadership possessed all the data they needed to stop the war years before the bombs fell. They knew the oil was gone, the ships were sunk, and the cities were burning. But the political structure of the imperial state, built on a foundation of spiritual superiority and military dominance, possessed no mechanism for admitting defeat. To admit the war was lost was to admit that the suffering of the people had been in vain, and that the Yamato spirit wasn't superior after all. They fought on not because they thought they could win, but because they couldn't agree on how to lose. In the end, it took the literal vaporization of cities and the intervention of a quote-unquote living God, speaking in what they believed to be the literal voice of God, to break the paralysis. On the morning of May 24, 1940, the grinding roar of the German war machine, which had been tearing through the French countryside, suddenly fell silent. The vanguard of General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps had reached the Eye Canal, a mere 10 miles from the port of Dunkirk. Through their binoculars, German tank commanders could see the spires of the town that offered the last lifeline for the trapped British Expeditionary Force. Complete victory was so close that it was literally visible. The British were reeling, their lines broken, their retreat chaotic, and their French allied armies were cut in two. And yet, instead of the order to attack, the radio crackled with a command that would baffle military historians for decades: halt. For 3 days, the most formidable armored force the world had ever seen sat idling on the heights overlooking the channel, watching as their enemy frantically organized an escape. It's a moment frozen in time, a decision that transformed a certain annihilation into the miracle of Dunkirk, and arguably saved the Allies from total defeat in the Second World War. To understand the halt order, one must first grasp the sheer speed of the German advance that preceded it. The invasion of France, Fall Gelb, had unfolded with a rapidity that stunned even the German high command. General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A had punched through the Ardennes, terrain considered impassable by the Allies, and crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 14th. This breakthrough allowed the panzer divisions to race across northern France, reaching the coast at Abbeville by May 20th. This severed the Allied supply lines and trapped the BEF, the Belgian Army, and the French First Army in a giant pocket against the sea. However, this spectacular success bred a deep, gnawing anxiety within the German command structure. The panzers had advanced so fast they'd outrun their infantry support by hundreds of kilometers. To the cautious minds of the older generation of officers, this exposed flank was a nightmare waiting to happen. Their fears were seemingly confirmed on May 21st, when the British launched a counterattack at Arras. Although it was a limited tactical strike involving heavily armored Matilda tanks, it sparked panic and forced Erwin Rommel to use anti-aircraft guns to stop the assault. While the attack failed, its psychological impact was immense. It convinced the German leadership that their armored corridor was vulnerable. Contrary to the popular myth that portrays the halt order as a sudden, erratic whim of the leader, the historical record shows it originated from the military leadership on the ground. On May 23rd, General Günther von Kluge, commander of the German Fourth Army, contacted General von Rundstedt. Kluge's report was grim. His panzer divisions were exhausted. After 2 weeks of continuous combat, mechanical attrition had taken a heavy toll. Some units reported that up to 50% of their tanks were non-operational due to breakdowns and battle damage. Von Kluge suggested a pause to allow the units to repair their vehicles and let the infantry catch up to secure the gains. Rundstedt, who had been watching the rapid advance with growing trepidation, readily agreed. He was a proponent of the classic military doctrine that prioritized the consolidation of territory before the final push. Furthermore, the terrain of Flanders loomed large in their calculations. The area around Dunkirk was a maze of canals and low-lying land that had been reclaimed from the sea. To Rundstedt and von Kluge, this was a potential graveyard for heavy tanks. They believed it foolish to risk their precious armored formations in such unsuitable ground when the war in France wasn't yet won. They proposed holding the armor at the canal line and letting the infantry of Army Group B crush the pocket. It was into this atmosphere of caution that the Austrian arrived at Rundstedt's headquarters in Charleville on the morning of May 24th. When Rundstedt presented his assessment that the tanks should halt to refit for the coming drive south against the French, the leader endorsed it enthusiastically. His own experiences as a soldier in Flanders during the Great War made him acutely wary of the marshy terrain. It wasn't him overruling his generals, as has been claimed in modern myth, but rather a siding with cautious field commanders against aggressive ones. For years, some historians propagated the theory that the Austrian leader halted the tanks as a golden bridge. This was a deliberate political gesture to allow the British to escape, hoping to secure a peace treaty with an Anglo-Saxon empire he admired. This is based upon the verified idea that he saw the English specifically as brothers, and others such as the Scots as cousins. However, modern research has thoroughly debunked this idea. There's no contemporary evidence from May 1940 to support it. In fact, Directive 13, issued the same day, explicitly ordered the annihilation of the Allied forces in the pocket. The goal was destruction, not mercy. The pause was a military decision driven by logistics, terrain, and inter-service politics, not a diplomatic olive branch. The decision to halt the tanks was also fueled by the colossal ego of Hermann Göring. Sensing an opportunity to glorify his Luftwaffe, Göring telephoned his boss and promised that his air force alone could destroy the trapped Allied armies. He argued that the tanks were unnecessary for the finale and should be preserved for the Battle of Paris. The leader, always eager to elevate the highly politically aligned Luftwaffe over the traditionalist Prussian Army Officer Corps, was receptive. He effectively outsourced the destruction to the Air Force, a decision that ignored the operational realities of weather, pilot fatigue, and the limitations of bombing dug-in troops. This shift in strategy provided the Allies with the one thing they desperately lacked: time. The halt order effectively froze the German armor for 3 critical days, from May 24th to May 26th. During this window, the British and French forces, who had been retreating in disarray, were able to flood into the Dunkirk perimeter and establish a coherent defense. Had the panzers attacked on the 24th, they would have likely overrun the port and the beaches before a defense could be organized. For the German soldiers on the front line, the order was baffling. General Wilhelm von Thoma, a tank commander near Berge, later recounted his frustration at standing on a hill and looking down into Dunkirk through his binoculars. He could see the confusion, the massing trucks, and the defenseless port, yet he was forbidden to move. His tanks sat idle, crews performing maintenance on tracks and engines, while the prize slipped away. Diaries from the period reflect a mix of relief at the respite and confusion at the strategic inertia. They watched the Luftwaffe dive bombers scream overhead, assuming the job was being done, unaware that the sands of the beaches were absorbing the impact of the bombs. On the other side of the line, the pause was perceived as a miracle. British soldier diaries describe a chaotic landscape of burning vehicles and refugees, but crucially, they note the absence of the terrifying German armor. They could see the panzers and knew that they would be decimated if they rolled towards them, but for some reason they just never did. This breathing space allowed discipline to hold. It allowed the Royal Navy to mobilize Operation Dynamo. It allowed the French First Army at Lille to fight a heroic delaying action that tied up 7 German divisions until May 31st, further relieving pressure on the coast. The silence of the panzers allowed the little ships, the hundreds of civilian vessels, to cross the channel on seas that were described as miraculously pond-like. What could have been the biggest disaster in British history became a rallying cry, with the little ships becoming symbols of everyday heroism. By the time the Austrian rescinded the halt order on the afternoon of May 26th, the moment had passed. It took another 16 hours for the German units to reorganize and resume the attack. When they finally rolled forward on May 27th, they didn't face a routed rabble, but a solidified wall of British and French resistance they couldn't break in time. By the time the operation ended on June 4th, nearly 350,000 Allied soldiers had been snatched from the jaws of defeat. When the Germans finally entered Dunkirk, they captured 40,000 brave French soldiers and mountains of abandoned equipment. They had won the battle for France, but they had lost the chance to end the war. The men who waded into the water at Dunkirk would return 4 years later as the spearhead of the liberation of Europe. Interestingly, some historians believe that the British may have been forced to the peace table had hundreds of thousands of soldiers been captured on those sandy shores.